So much. How's everyone doing today? Thanks for coming out to the 6th annual Rhode Island Authors Expo. My name is Mike Stanton, and I didn't have to come far today. I live about a mile down the road near Roger Williams Park, because that's Rhode Island, right? Everything's local. I want to thank Paul Cianci, one of the authors here and organizers of this event. And this being Rhode Island, of course, I first met Paul during a federal corruption investigation of North Providence by the FBI. Paul was on the town council there, and there was an investigation of 3 town council members taking bribes to approve a zoning variance for a Stop and Shop. Actually by the same guy that built the Stop and Shop in this neighborhood. Paul was not one of the guys taking bribes. He was the other councilman who wore a wire for the FBI. So anyway, that's how I first met Paul. And so it's kind of a small world. But that in a nutshell, I think is why Rhode Island is for writers. And we may be the smallest state, but I think we have a big heart and we have a big reservoir of stories to tell. And we don't really have to look any farther than the neighborhood that we're in right now, Patuxent Village. If you just kind of go across the river, you would find the bungalow where Charles Dexter Ward conducted his diabolical experiments with the occult in H.P. Lovecraft's classic horror story, The Strange Case of Charles Dexter Ward. He, of course, Lovecraft grew up on the east side of Providence, spent pretty much all of his life there, and he was the father of the American horror story. Patuxent Village was also the home of a hidden literary talent, Elisha Hunt Rhodes, who wrote a Civil War diary that was discovered by Ken Burns when he did his epic PBS documentary history about the Civil War. And the past really is alive all around us if we choose to listen. I live on Betsy Williams Drive, on land that Roger Williams' granddaughter used to have her horse stables for her farm. And she later, of course, donated her farm to the city of Providence for Roger Williams Park. And the house behind me was once the home of Henry Temelio, who was Raymond Patriarca's underboss of the New England Mafia in the 1960s. And Henry later went to prison, and I used to get my hair cut by a barber, a lovely old Italian gentleman next to J.P. Spoonham's, who grew up with all these guys and visited Henry in prison and would tell me stories about it. My neighbor told me a story about a work crew was digging up the telephone lines one day and found some hidden phone lines that had apparently gone to Temelio's house that the mob used to make untraceable phone calls to New York and Las Vegas. So I'm also told that Henry Temelio's brother, who was a legitimate guy, a doctor or a lawyer, lived in my house, but I need to check that out. I have certainly not found any gold in the basement. But I think that shows that, history is all around us. And, 2 of my favorite books that I have is Roger Williams' Key to the Narragansett Language, which was a colonial era bestseller in England. And I also have Vinnie Teresa's My Life in the Mafia. He was another Raymond Patriarca underboss who, gave his inside account of those days. So I've always loved history, and in both of my books, and I'll get out my little props. So far I've written 2 books, and each one has a bobblehead character, Buddy Cianci and Rocky Marciano. So with each of these books I set out to write a biography, but what I quickly discovered was that I was actually writing a social history. Buddy, of course, being Buddy, got really mad at me when he found out that I was writing a book, and he was writing his own book, and he felt that he used to say to me that this was his story, and I said, no, Buddy, it's history. And so we used to go back and forth like that. But when I got the contract to write The Prince of Providence, it was during Operation Plunderdome, and the FBI corruption case that would eventually bring Buddy down. And at the time, that was no short proposition. And to me, the drama was to follow this case as it unfolded and see whether the feds really could nail Buddy Cianci in his own town, and whether a jury of Buddy's peers would actually convict him of doing a crime, given how popular he was. So what happened was I started writing the book, and I figured, there would be a couple of chapters about, his earlier days. But I started an excavation of his past, and I realized that that was going to be more than just a chapter or two. It wound up being half the book before we even get to Operation Plunderdome. So that really taught me two valuable lessons. The first one is, don't assume that you know the whole story, even of something that everybody talks about and thinks they know the whole story. Now, we all knew that Buddy hit a guy with a fireplace log. We all knew about the corruption in his first administration. We all knew that he'd been accused of raping a woman at gunpoint when he was a law student. But there's a power, I think, to digging deep and taking nothing for granted and telling the story and talking to people and looking up documents and just trying to recreate the moment and make it so vivid that you think the reader is there. So you're in Buddy's living room in the chapter I call The Nightmare on Power Street, when he's torturing this man, Raymond DeLeo, with a lit cigarette and a fireplace log and an ashtray. And it was so vivid that when I turned in the manuscript to Random House, they kind of freaked out because they thought, wow, this is libelous, and they got the libel lawyers to go through it. Same with the chapter about the Marquette rape accusation. And I think that really showed to me the power of leaving no stone unturned. Don't just take a popular story for granted, and the power of narrative storytelling to put the reader in the moment. And I had a great editor. I spent many years as a reporter at the Providence Journal, and I had a great editor who taught me a really wonderful lesson about taking journalism deeper. Journalism is known as the first rough draft of history, but what we wanted to do was take it to the next level and tell a story. And the best advice that Tom Hessler, my editor, ever gave me was, he said, slow it down. Don't smother the reader with every interesting fact and detail that you dig up. Take your time, hold it up for examination. As a former colleague of mine at the Journal said, like fireflies in a jar, so you can illuminate the moment. Keep it spare, unpack those dense sentences and those lists of facts and details, and use only what you need. The other phrase Tom used to always tell me that stuck with me is, kill your darlings. Be ruthless. We all have that favorite anecdote, that clever turn of phrase that we came up with, that we just fell in love with. But if it's a detour that takes us away from the narrative and takes the reader away from the story, you're off track, so you just have to let it go. Writing is a funny, strange, isolating business. The great Sports Illustrated writer Lee Montville, who I had talked to one of my classes at the University of Connecticut last month, he's written 9 books, including biographies of Babe Ruth and Ted Williams. And he said, it's a strange profession, right? We live in caves for 2 years, and then we pop our heads out for 2 weeks to see the sunlight, and then we go back into our cave. And I guess it's like Groundhog Day, except we're always seeing our shadow, so we're always going back into our cave. So I guess the question is, what really drives somebody, to this, joyful, painful profession? And I think there's a couple of things. For me, I have this image of when I was a boy, and I grew up in the Hartford, Connecticut area, a little rural town, and we would go strawberry picking. I just have this image of it's sunset, and we've picked our strawberries, and I'm sitting by the side of the field, and I've got my Big Chief notebook tablet, and I've got a pencil, and I start writing down a story. And the sunlight seems to illuminate this mound of dirt, and it looks like an ancient burial mound. And that's the tomb of an ancient mummy, and the mummy is coming to life. And it gives birth to my imagination and my first story, which was entitled Flash Gordon Meets the Mummy. Classic. So I was always writing stories and reading books. And I think the other thing about writing is that it's kind of a communion of our shared experience. And I think that's even more important than ever today, when our country is so divided. And even beyond political divides and social divides and divides of ethnicity and race, I think there's just a divide created by social media, which can be a wonderful tool and has informed our lives in many ways. But it can also just isolate us and take away some of that shared experience and diminish it into these little sound bites of hate and vitriol and trying to outwit everyone. And so I think it's always good, and I think there is this counter trend as newspapers and print struggles. There is a counter trend of people who want to read. And yes, they may not read a hardcover book, but they read it on their Kindle, they read it on their iPad, they read long-form narrative. And I think there's a hunger in us for stories that goes back to the times of, think of the cave people. I mean, every day was a struggle. They couldn't just drive to Stop and Shop and get their dinner. They had to go out and hunt it and cook it and clean it. They had to find clothes. They couldn't go buy it off the rack. And yet they still found time for storytelling in the form of cave paintings on the walls and telling stories around the campfire. And as civilization spread, it was the written word that really united people. And it was, traveling minstrels and storytellers around the campfire and the town criers and the town square and so on and so forth. So I think those are some of the reasons that we write. You sit down at your computer, you stare at the screen, you shuffle through your notes, you rearrange your sentences and punctuation, and you're waiting for the muse to strike, but you have to kind of put one foot in front of the other until you start to gather a little speed, you gather a little momentum, and you start to really, the fingers fly over the keyboard like you're creating a symphony. And that's a fun moment. And it's painful to get that first draft out, but if you can tell yourself that, it's just a first draft, and it's gonna stink, and you're okay with that, because then you have something that you can sculpt, and you can mold, and you can kill your darlings, and you can, take out the stuff that's extraneous. And sometimes that's fun, just to winnow it down and make it smaller as well. So I think that, there was a favorite cartoon from the New Yorker that I used to have over my desk for many years. And it showed these writers that are on an island. And they're on a cliff, and that goes all around the island. And they all have individual desks with typewriters and pencils and paper. And some of them are sitting there looking perplexed, others are pacing around their desk. And the title of the cartoon is Block Island. Another great Rhode Island reference. But there is that great moment, when you break through and you start to see the light, and I think that's what I enjoy about writing. So I mentioned 2 lessons I learned, and the second lesson I learned kind of goes to the point of my talk today about recreating history, and that is that all history is biography, and your little narrative is just the scaffolding for a bigger tale. So I wasn't just writing a book about Buddy Cianci, I was writing about Providence, and about its rich, colorful past, how Roger Williams fled Massachusetts and founded this colony based on religious tolerance, which became a fundamental part of our U.S. Constitution. I wrote about the history of how we were, in a sense, America's first safe house, because Roger Williams fled here from Massachusetts Bay when they were about to evict him and send him back to England. And he started this colony he called Divine Providence. And it was later known as Rogue's Isle, a reputation that has followed us through the centuries. Cotton Mather called it the fag end of creation and the sewer of New England. Later, it was the hotbed of the slave trade. Samuel Slater stole the plans from England for America's first textile mill in Pawtucket. The Industrial Revolution, immigration, ethnic machine, urban politics, the rise of organized crime. Rhode Island really is a microcosm of America and the American experience. And who better to tell the story of Rhode Island than this guy, Buddy Cianci? He's shaking his head, yes, he agrees with me. It's not often that Buddy agrees with me. So, to quote from H.P. Lovecraft again, he kind of symbolized Buddy to me. If you go to his grave in Swan Point Cemetery, he's got inscribed on it, "I am Providence." And that's kind of how I viewed Buddy's story, is I'm telling the story of Providence and by extension America. And just as an aside, the author of the Game of Thrones novels, Martin, he was in New England, I think last year for a convention, and he made it a point to take a side trip to Swan Point Cemetery to visit the grave of H.P. Lovecraft. Again, Rhode Island's contribution to literature and horror. So, I wrote my first book about Buddy Cianci, And people liked it, and it did well outside of Rhode Island, I think for all these reasons I was talking about. And then when I left the Providence Journal about 6 years ago to teach at the University of Connecticut, I finally had the opportunity to pursue another book that had been nagging at me for years, and that was a biography of Rocky Marciano. And a lot of people ask me, in fact, a few people asked me this morning, why Rocky Marciano? Why a boxer? Vicious sport. Not many people pay attention to it anymore. And to me, it was really, again, it wasn't a story about boxing. It wasn't just a story about Rocky. It was a story about a time and a place in America that's kind of lost now. That era right after World War II, the greatest generation. And I kind of came to it through Buddy Cianci, because when I was researching his childhood, again, I thought I was just going to focus on his corruption case at City Hall. And I wound up going back to his childhood. And he was born in 1940 in Silver Lake, and his father was a doctor, and his father would take him to the Rhode Island Auditorium on North Main Street. And he would take him to the fights, and Rocky Marciano was the headliner. It was a very colorful scene. You had gangsters, politicians, lawyers, judges, factory workers, all shoulder to shoulder in this arena watching the fights. And it was an ethnic pride. At the same time that Rocky Marciano was fighting there and all the Italians loved him, you had Giorgio Araujo from Fox Point. So you had all the Cape Verdean and Portuguese people following him very closely. And the other thing, it was a personal connection to me because my late father, who passed away about 17 years ago, he grew up in a factory town in Ware, Massachusetts, kind of like the factory town that Rocky grew up in Brockton, Massachusetts, about a half hour from here. And he went to, he served in the Army, he went to college on the GI Bill, and he went to college at Bryant College, as it was then known, and it was then on the east side of Providence near Brown University. And I have a picture at home of him standing on the steps with his graduating class in the years between World War II and the outbreak of the Korean War. And when he passed away, I was going through his things, and I found an autographed poster of Rocky Marciano in his things. And it was one of those, sports section cartoons that shows all of Rocky's individual opponents being knocked down or defeated. And it was autographed by Rocky. And so I thought that was kind of cool. And so that kind of led me to this story about, again, this greatest generation, this lost era. You'd hear the romantic radio calls from Madison Square Garden. People would go to Toots Shores on Broadway. You'd have the working class city of docks and immigrants and tenements that really is no more. And you had Damon Runyon, you had Frank Sinatra. If you were the heavyweight champion of the world back then, you were a larger-than-life figure. Everybody knew who you were. So to me, boxing was a prism of America in the middle of the 20th century. So Rocky was a cultural icon. He was friends with Frank Sinatra. Jackie Gleason asked him to train him for a movie role he was about to do, and he came up to Brockton, and Rocky told him he was going to put him through the ropes and have him run and stop eating the rich food that he loved to eat. And Jackie took one look at this training routine and said, well, let's have one big blowout before we start tomorrow morning. So they ordered all these pizzas and beer and scotch, and Jackie got hammered. And the next morning, Jackie just never showed up for the training. He said, I'm out of here. And he went back to New York. And the movie was The Hustler, and the role was Minnesota Fats. So I guess he didn't really have to be in shape for that role. One of the cool things I found out was that Rocky, this always impresses my children, the Star Wars generation, that Rocky was good friends with Carrie Fisher's parents, Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds. Rocky, back then, again, the glamour of boxing, the boxers would go off into the wilderness, and they would train in the mountains in the Catskills. And Rocky would train at this old Jewish resort, Grossinger's. And all the entertainers would go to the hotel down the hill, and then they'd come up to watch Rocky spar. And so Rocky became good friends with a lot of movie stars and celebrities and singers. Jerry Lewis would take him out for a walk and say, you're the king of the world, Rock. And so Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds, they were like the hot Hollywood couple at the time. And after Rocky had defended, after one of Rocky's title fights, they flew him out to the Hollywood Bowl, where he was on the Gillette Cavalcade of Stars entertainment hour with Louis Armstrong and an opera singer, and Eddie Fisher was the host, and Rocky was teasing him about he got to marry Debbie, who was in the front row. And later, before Rocky's last fight, Debbie and Eddie confided in him that they were engaged, and they would announce it to the world after Rocky's fight. So that's the kind of pull that the heavyweight champion of the world had back then. And I even found that after Rocky retired, he was a cultural icon as the world changed in the 1960s. Chubby Checker was excited to meet him. I found outtakes from a recording session of the Beatles where John Lennon and Paul McCartney were talking about Rocky Marciano. So I thought that was kind of cool. And the other thing about boxing that really drew me to this story was the individuality of a man in the ring, you know, defending himself with nobody else to help him in this increasingly impersonal age of cities and factories. And it became a real ethnic source of identity. And, you know, if you look at the people that fight, it's usually the people from the lower rungs of society. So in the early 20th century, you had the great Jewish fighters coming from the tenements of New York. Then you had the Irish fighters coming over from Ireland. Then you had the Italian fighters, then black fighters. So it was this whole stew of ethnicity and race and rivalry, and it's the immigrant experience, you know, in a squared circle. And Rocky, one of the interesting things about race is, you know, long before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, Joe Louis broke a color barrier in boxing and became a national icon during the Great Depression when he beat Hitler's champion, Max Schmeling, in a fight that everyone around the world followed. And it transcended race. In fact, Jimmy Cannon, the sports columnist, wrote that Joe Louis is credit to his race, the human race. And Louis had broken a color barrier that had held since the early 1900s, when Jack Johnson had been the champion but scandalized America for dating white women and partying in nightclubs and driving flashy cars. So Joe Louis was told to be the right kind of Negro. So Rocky is the first white champion since Joe Louis when he takes the title in 1952, and he becomes, against his own wishes, the Great White Hope. And it's not something he welcomes. He kind of identifies with the experience of the black fighter. You know, when he was young, he grew up in Brockton in the 1920s and 30s when Italians were reviled. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested on the Brockton streetcar not far from Rocky's home and executed for a robbery they didn't commit. Ironically, it was Raymond Patriarchus guys that did that heist. So Rocky kind of identified with that. And then, ironically, you get into the 1950s, and we're in the Cold War, and Rocky and Joe DiMaggio, rather than being Italians at the bottom of the order, are now all-American heroes. And, you know, Rocky packed a powerful knockout punch. And his manager kind of tied him in with the Cold War, said he had a punch with the power of the atomic bomb. And Rocky his career was bookended by two great black fighters, Joe Louis before him, and Muhammad Ali afterwards. And it was interesting to me to dig into this racial history and find that Rocky became good friends with both men. And he became friends with Joe Louis, who he actually knocked out to end Louis's career and put Rocky on the fast track to the title in 1950, in 51 actually. And later he became really good friends with Louis. He cried the night he knocked him out because he'd knocked out his own boyhood idol. Rocky and a friend had been at the Brockton Fair listening on the radio when Louis beat Schmeling. When Louis came to Brockton to referee a boxing card, Rocky and his friend Izzy Gold followed Louis everywhere he went. They even followed him to the bathroom. And Louis gave him each 50 cents. And now here you are about, 12 years later, and Rocky's beating him and ending his career. But later they became good friends. When Louis fell on hard times financially, Rocky helped him get a job at a Las Vegas casino. Later, when Rocky's retired, he was the champion of the 50s, and now we're in the 1960s, and there's this brash young Olympic gold medalist named Cassius Clay, and he's fighting Sonny Liston for the title in Miami. And an old fight promoter I interviewed for the book, Lou Duva, who was also known locally because he was Vinny Pazienza's manager later on. But Lou Duva was driving in his car with Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano in Miami Beach. And before the fight, they're down there for the fight, and they hear on the radio how much money Ali is getting, or Clay is getting for the fight, which is much more than they ever earned in their careers. And Rocky and Louis both said, "Stop the car, Lou," and they jumped out of the car and they started jogging along the car like, "We're going to do road work and go back into training so we can get some of that money." So then Ali, Cassius Clay, becomes the champion, changes his name to Muhammad Ali. We all know his story of how he refused to be drafted into the Army and go fight in Vietnam. I ain't got no quarrel with those Viet Cong, he said famously. So what a lot of people forget back then, he was not the national icon that he later became when he passed away a few years ago. A lot of people, especially white America, hated Muhammad Ali. They hated his Islamic sounding name. They hated his brash militancy. They hated his anti-patriotism as they viewed it for refusing to fight in the army. And he had no money. He was suspended from boxing. He was actually ordered to go to prison, and he appealed it. He was facing a 5-year prison term. And during his exile, needing money, he wound up doing this really bizarre computer fight with Rocky Marciano in the summer of 1969, when the world is changing all around us. And it was interesting because a promoter in Miami thought, oh, let's do this hypothetical matchup. We all like to talk about who would beat who. You know, would today's Red Sox beat the 27 Yankees and so on. So they decided to use this newfangled technology called a computer, which was then about the size of a refrigerator. And they fed all these statistics about both fighters into it, and they had detailed questionnaires from sports writers, and the computer spit out a scenario of how a fight between the two of them in their prime would unfold. And then they got together in a secret studio, a boxing gym in Miami, and they filmed all the scenarios. They sparred about 70 rounds with each other. It was top secret, you know, covers over the window so nobody could peek in. And surprisingly, these two men bonded during the filming of that fight, computer fight. You have the white conformist from the 50s, you have the brash militant from the 60s. But Rocky, I interviewed Rocky's brother who was there, and I also interviewed Ali's wife at the time who was there. And they both told me the same story about how Rocky kind of identified with Ali because he identified with the discrimination that his Italian ancestors had gone through, what happened with Sacco and Vanzetti. And he encouraged Ali to hang tough. He says, people are just are out to get you because you're being different, but stick to your guns. And he defended him. And it was interesting, one day they were sitting by the side of the ring during a break in filming, and they had a bag of grapefruit, and Ali was peeling the grapefruit and tearing off big wedges with his fingers and passing them to Rocky. And they started talking about the race riots in America in the 60s. And they talked about what can we do to help heal that. And they actually hatched this idea. They said, what if you and me, a white man and a black man, got on a bus and we went to Watts and we went to Detroit and we went to Chicago and we talked about how whites and blacks can get along. And Ali got really excited. He goes, would you do it? Would you do it? And Rocky was like, yeah, I would do it. And it's interesting to imagine if that had happened, you know, given how Ali was regarded by white America at the time and how white America would have responded to Rocky doing that. But tragically, we'll never know, because a few weeks later, Rocky was in Chicago, supposed to fly home for his 46th birthday the next day, and a mob pal asked him to detour to Iowa to go to a nephew's steakhouse opening. And he got on a small private plane, and the plane flew into a thunderstorm over Iowa with an inexperienced pilot, and it crashed, and Rocky was killed. And the Los Angeles Times columnist, Jim Murray, wrote a great epitaph. He said, start the count, he'll get up. You know, a lot of us are wishing today that there were an honest referee in a cornfield in Iowa. And Ali's wife told me that when he got the news that Rocky had been killed, it was the only time that she ever saw him cry. So finding hidden gems like that was really, you know, something that really drew me to his story. And, you know, the last thing I'll mention is that when he was in the Army, you know, we always think, again, we take for granted, we know the story, And you know, Rocky was a hero in the 50s, and sports writers weren't like sports writers today. They didn't dig into the dark corners of an athlete's life. Babe Ruth, famous drinker and womanizer. No, sports writers in the age didn't write about that. Rocky was seen as an all-American boy, immigrant son, took care of his family, served his country in World War II, served in an Army combat engineer unit, helped ferry supplies to Normandy during the D-Day invasion. Important part of the hero resume. But what I found was there were some dark whispers about what really happened in the Army. Sports Illustrated let me into their archives. And back then, these news magazines had huge staffs of reporters that would fan out and dig up every fact in detail. And they'd have files with this. And again, kill your darlings. A lot of this stuff would never make it into the actual article. And I was able to get into those archives. And the reporter in Brockton said, you know, everybody gets really kind of strange when I ask about Rocky's Army experience. And suddenly they can't remember any details. I think something happened there. I think he got drunk in a bar, he punched some guy, he went AWOL, whatever. But that was it. And that didn't even make it into print. That's what I found in the archive notes. So I contacted the National Archives in St. Louis, which keeps military records. And the archivist, you always have these aha moments as a writer and a researcher that are always worth all the dead ends that you hit. And the archivist said, well, because he's a prominent person, we've digitized his main Army service file, and we can give you that on a CD for $50. And then she kind of paused, she said, oh, and we also have a paper copy of his court-martial, if you'd like that as well, for another $50. And I said, I would like that as well. So they sent it to me, and what I found was this whole story that nobody had ever known, that Rocky and another American GI in Wales, while they were awaiting deployment to Normandy, they went AWOL. They went into town for a night of drinking. They were not drunk. They went back to the home of two British civilian men who worked at a local airplane company, and they attacked and robbed them. They stole their wallet, they stole some other belongings, they punched them a few times, really kind of beat them up a little bit. And they were court-martialed for that. And there's a whole trial transcript. And somebody's cutting me off at the good point. So Rocky did not... Oh, wow. I just banged. Here, okay. So, that's how I fix my remote at home. So Rocky never actually went to Normandy. He was in a military stockade. He was sentenced to serve 7 years of hard labor in a military prison. And to me, it doesn't make him a bad person. It makes him a human person with flaws and obstacles that he overcame and mistakes that he made as a young man. But what was interesting was, in reconstructing that story, World War II ends in 1945, and because of his conviction, he stayed in the Army, finished out, his sentence was reduced, he served 2 years. He finished out his sentence, and then he stayed in the Army a year past the end of the war. And that really launched his boxing career. And because of that, he was able to go out to Fort Lewington, a big Army base out there, and started formally boxing for the first time on an Army team. And he made it to the championships of the National Junior AAU Championship in Portland, Oregon. And he lost that fight, but one of the reasons he lost, he was a rude, crude fighter at the time, but in the semifinal, he was such an awkward, though hard puncher that he hit his opponent on the top of the head, and he shattered his knuckle and pushed the bone up into his hand. And it blew up like a balloon, and he had somebody give him a shot of something to freeze it for the final fight, but then he had to go to the Army hospital at Fort Lewis. And the surgeon there was a Japanese-American doctor, and he performed an experimental operation, and he pulled the broken pieces of bone back into place in traction, and he basically saved Rocky's career before it had really had a chance to begin, because Rocky may have never been able to fight again. And so later in life, Rocky's telling that story, and he says, I wish I remember that doctor's name so I could thank him. And I found the doctor's name in Rocky's military records, and his name was Dr. Thomas Takeda. And again, this is an immigrant story. Thomas Takeda, while he was, going into the Army and in medical school, his family was interned in California, you know, as Japanese Americans during World War II. They were in these internment camps. And the only reason he was spared was because he was in medical school in Cleveland, Ohio. And I tracked down, Takeda had passed away, but I tracked down his two sons, who were both elderly doctors themselves, who had just retired. And they sent me his medical file, and it was remarkable. He had to agree when he got admitted to medical school to sign what was called a non-Caucasian clause that basically said, okay, you're a Japanese doctor, you have to do clinical work and treat patients to become a doctor. If any patients object to being treated by a Japanese, tough luck, you're just going to have to accept that and leave medical school and not be a doctor. And he signed that. And fortunately for him, and fortunately for Rocky Marciano, nobody objected, and he was able to do his clinical and become a doctor and be in the right place at the right time to save Rocky's career. And there's a famous photo I have in the book of when Rocky is the champion. He goes to the White House with Joe DiMaggio, and he meets Dwight Eisenhower. And President Eisenhower, there's a famous photo, if I can find it here, where Eisenhower is holding up Rocky's fist, kind of saying, you know, Rocky was not a big guy, but he had a big fist. And it's this picture right here on the top left. And what's really cool about that was Takeda's family sent me a photo of their father at the Fort Lewis military hospital a few months before he took care of Rocky. Then General Eisenhower came through the hospital and to visit wounded veterans. And there's a photo of Dr. Thomas Takeda with Dwight Eisenhower, and then you flash forward, 6 years, and now President Eisenhower is holding that same fist that Dr. Thomas Takeda repaired. So to me, it's those kinds of twists and turns that make for wonderful storytelling and bringing history alive. And, you know, I think to quote, you know, H.P. Lovecraft again, you know, this I am Providence, that you can tell the story of a lot of things through one person. So now I'd like to open it up to questions, and then the organizers tell me I'm supposed to go out to a table in the middle of the room and sign any books for anybody that would like. But does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
Did you find any, in your research, did you find any connections between Marciano's story and Rocky Balboa and Sylvester Stallone?
Oh, good question. He asked if I find any, in my research, did I find any connections between Rocky Marciano's story and Rocky Balboa, the Sylvester Stallone movie Rocky? And yes, big connection. That was one of the inspirations of Sylvester Stallone. He saw the computer fight between Ali and Rocky, which, by the way, Rocky won, knocked him out in the 13th round. And so he saw that fight, and he had it in the back of his mind. He was a young, struggling actor at the time. And then he saw a fight when Ali was back in boxing after his suspension was over, and he won his case, and he fought this white fighter who was an underdog named Chuck Wepner, who bled a lot and was totally outclassed by Ali, but gave him a real battle. And those two things inspired the Rocky Balboa story by Sylvester Stallone. And it was interesting because if you watch that movie, the very first scene, you know, it starts when Rocky is this dreary club fighter in a Philadelphia gym, and he's just slogged through a fight, and he goes back to his, you know, horrid apartment, and he opens it up, and there over the fireplace mantle is a poster of Rocky Marciano. And towards the end of the movie, when he fights Apollo Creed, the big epic fight on Christmas Eve, it's the night before the fight, and he's sitting up worrying, and it's Christmas, and there's they pan to the Marciano poster again, and he's got cotton on his face like a Santa Claus beard and Christmas lights strung over him. And if you see scenes like Rocky's manager, Mickey was patterned after Rocky's manager, Charlie Golden, who was a great character. He was an old Jewish fighter. He fought like over 200 fights in the early 1900s in New York when fighting was illegal. And he did a lot of the training things that you see in the movie. He tied Rocky Marciano's shoelaces together to teach him better balance, and did things like that. So yeah, there was a connection. So I tried to interview Sylvester Stallone for the book, but he wouldn't talk to me. He said he would eagerly read the book, so we'll see if he did. Yes, sir.
when choosing like subjects for your books, how do you go about it, and what stories do you think most interest you to try and tell the other sides of?
Yeah, how do I pick my subjects?
Yeah, because when choosing someone like Buddy, having
Yeah.
to deal with Buddy,
Yeah, you know, I always joked when I wrote the second book about Rocky, I'm writing about a dead guy, he can't come after me.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, Buddy kind of chose me in a way. You know, I was covering his case for the Providence Journal. He was such a larger-than-life character. I actually had, there was a former reporter at the Providence Journal named Jonathan Karp who went to Brown. And he worked at the Journal for a couple of years, and then he got smart and he left and he became a big shot publisher. And he became the head of Random House. And so when Buddy's case was heating up, and it was making national news, because Buddy was a national figure then, he was on the Imus radio show all the time. And so I called John Karp, and I said, John, I'm thinking of writing a book about Buddy. And he goes, I've been waiting for somebody to call me and say they want to write a book about Buddy. That's a great idea. You're going to need an agent, though. So I recommend this guy I worked at the Brown Daily Herald with, Andrew Blount. So I got in touch with Andrew through John, and Andrew agreed to become my agent, and he's terrific. And so and then we sold the book back to John. So it's the Brown Mafia came into play. But as far as choosing story, and it's funny because you want it to be marketable, and you want it to be something, it's got to interest you, and it's got to have enough layers of complexity to sustain a book. And you know, publishers are funny because when you put a book proposal out there, they want something that's fresh and original and has never been done, but they also want to show why this book is going to sell. So you've got to compare it. It's like real estate. You've got to have comparables. What are other books that are similar? So I remember a lot of publishers passed on Buddy's story because they thought he was too local. And one publisher told my agent, well, you know, we just did a book on Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York, and that didn't do very well. And we're like rolling our eyes, like, really, one has nothing to do with the other. But then it became a New York Times bestseller, so you can't predict. It was just a great story, and I think that's it. You just got to find a great story. And as far as Rocky Marciano goes, there was some resistance. Oh, a boxing book? Boxing's not really big nowadays. But I sold it as a social history, and there had not been a lot of books about Rocky. Certainly not like Muhammad Ali. Although I liked Lee Montville, the old Sports Illustrated writer's comment. They asked him, he wrote a book about Ali, and they said, but haven't there been a lot of books about Ali? He goes, yeah, but nobody's read my book about Ali. So I thought it's a great story, and it's interesting. Random House had the first rights to look at my proposal for my next book, and the editor there, it was not John Karp, he had moved on to a different publisher. And the editor who looked at it said, oh, you know, my father loved Rocky Marciano, it's a great story, but I don't think a boxing book would sell. So then we were able to put it out to other publishers, and we had 7 publishers all very excited about it. Because it's that kind of, it appeals to that kind of greatest generation, you know, that kind of era in American history. And people love books about history. I think history is a really popular genre right now. So, but the main thing is find something passionate and then meld it to something that people will want to read. Yes, sir.
When you mentioned H.P. Lovecraft, do you always find it amusing that the Rhode Islanders don't seem to know what's right under their nose? You know, that the rest of the world, they have a conference in Providence and people come for H.P. Lovecraft and everyone's talking about Stephen King, and the Rhode Islanders look around and they say, what are you talking about?
I guess. I don't know. I mean, I guess I know about Lovecraft, so I can't put myself in the shoes of people who don't. But he was a little out there. And he was a weird guy in his real life. And, you know, not really a great writer stylistically, but he told, you know, some really macabre stories. And he inspired a lot of the famous horror writers of today, like Martin of Game of Thrones and Stephen King and others. So, yeah, but I mean, I think it's true of anything. You take things for granted in your own backyard. And, you know, Rhode Island's been around for over 3 centuries, so we obviously have a strong, you know, literary history. Yes, in the back.
Do you think it's easier to tell a story from the perspective of a biography rather than tracing events?
I think it's a case-by-case thing. Did you have a particular event in mind that you wanted to share?
Well, I just noticed that Bunny story could easily have been framed as a story of Providence rather than just him himself, but he's so emblematic in the city as well.
Yeah, well, and I think when you have a generic, not a generic story, but you have a story like Providence, you need a character to kind of propel the narrative and make people care and follow the action and the scenes. And there's a classic book that was a really big bestseller several years back called In the Garden of Midnight of In the Garden of Midnight of Good and Evil or something like that. And it was set in Savannah, Georgia, isn't it? And that was a wonderful book because it captured the atmosphere of this really romantic city and its history and the voodoo culture, and it basically framed it around the story of a murder involving some prominent people in town. And one of the big characters was a cross-dressing voodoo priestess or something. I could be wrong, I can't remember all the details, but there were a lot of colorful characters, and that got made into a movie. But yeah, I mean, you could have an event, like I know a guy who wrote a book about these two mountain climbers that got stranded on a mountain and the story of their dramatic rescue. One lived and one died. You have a particular event like that you can build certainly a story around. But yeah, I think it was, well, I don't know who said it, but all history is biography. I didn't make that up, but I think it's really true. Hey, Paul. How are you? I mentioned you at the outset. I said that I got into this, the first time I met you was through an FBI investigation.
Great way to meet.
But you were the guy wearing the wire, not taking the bribe, so it all worked out. So.
Good seeing you.
Okay, thank you.
This one's going to wrap up soon, right?
Yeah, we're going to wrap up. Just I think if anyone else has a question or two, otherwise I think I'm out in the middle of the hall here, and I'm happy to sign books. They brought the Prince of Providence too. So you can get the double set. Well, thank you very much. You've been a very good audience, and enjoy the fair.